Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, he invited his main rivals to serve in his cabinet, and they grew to become his allies. A conversation about what we can learn from Abraham Lincoln as I talk with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. That's Dialogue. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A welcome as well to our public radio listeners. What if President George W. Bush had asked John McCain, Steve Forbes, and Orrin Hatch to be in his cabinet when he won the presidency in 2000? They were all his rivals for the Republican nomination. Well, there would have been a precedent. Abraham Lincoln asked three of his opponents from the 1860 presidential race to serve as his Secretary of War, Secretary of the Treasury, and Attorney General. His reasons, as well as the results of that risky move, are chronicled in Team of Rivals, the latest book by presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. Goodwin, who spent 10 years researching the book, had become less visible on the public stage after being accused of plagiarism. She admitted she hadn't been as cautious with footnotes as she should have been on a book that she wrote many years ago. Her reputation intact, Team of Rivals has gone on to become a bestseller and won the Lincoln Prize in 2005 as the best book on the Civil War. Now, Ms. Goodwin was at the Sun Valley Writers Conference in 2006, and it was there that I spoke with her about the lessons we can learn from Lincoln's ability to forge alliances and what it was like to live for a decade with Lincoln's memory all around her. Well, first of all, welcome back to Idaho.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. You know, the last time that you were on Dialogue was in 1999, and you were already 4 years into the research for this book. It came out last year, so another 6 years. That's 10 years essentially living with somebody. That's a long time to be with one person.
I loved every moment of it, though.
Did you ever feel, I mean, I'm not going to ask you to be like Mary Todd Lincoln and be into seances like she was, but did you ever feel his presence around you?
You know, there's something about Lincoln's emotional strengths that I really do think rub off on anybody who studied him. I've talked to all the other Lincoln scholars. We've sort of developed this camaraderie, and it's extraordinary how each one of us feels that the presence of him over the period of time that we've lived with him was probably the happiest professional experience in our life. My husband always teases me because I'll say, I've lived with Lincoln for 10 years, but I could have lived with him another 10 years. My publisher wouldn't have been happy, but I would have.
So his presence in the sense of, feeling him in the room with you, or what kind of presence?
You know what it is? You wake up in the morning and I go into this place. I used to work on a chaise lounge, actually, ridiculous, because I have a laptop on my top and all my books around me. And I'd read over what I'd written the day before, and invariably there was something hilarious that he had said because of his extraordinary storytelling ability. So whatever had happened in the news the night before, you know, it could have been, you know, Monica Lewinsky or Bill Clinton or O.J. Simpson or all these sad things, and suddenly there's Lincoln with me the next morning. Even though it's the Civil War, there was that lightened, vibrant personality to come back to in the morning. It was great.
Well, I'm sure there's many politicians during these times that are rereading his works to try and get some inspiration for their own decisions. Now, I just want to say right up front and talk about it that some of that decade was taken up with your response to accusations of plagiarism, which folks can go read more about if they want. But you have said that you took some inspiration from Lincoln's management style himself in how you dealt with that issue in your own personal life.
Well, the one thing that's clear is that historians understand that what happened by having footnotes in the back means that you're clearly crediting the author. It was just a question of not having the right quote marks in certain passages. But I acknowledged it. I acknowledged it at the time, 20 years ago. When it became public again, I acknowledged it again. And I think that's the most important thing Lincoln would say. Just say what happened, be straight about it, and then go forward. And that's luckily what was able to happen.
How did you change your work process, both the researching and the ultimate writing of this book, because of that situation?
Well, I think the main difference is technological. Now using a computer and having computer ability to scan notes from books means you're not dealing with handwritten notes from books that can get much more confused, where you're not sure what you're taking from. So this way the books are scanned, the computers are there, you're not doing it in handwriting, and you're just much more careful. You know that spending the time to make sure that every footnote is absolutely right is as important as spending the time to get the characters right. So I made sure to do that.
Let's talk about Lincoln a little bit before we talk about the specifics of your book. Let's talk about him. What's your earliest memory of Lincoln growing up from school books? What was your image of him?
Well, there were these old blue biographies when I was growing up, and they were about Lincoln. They were about Thomas Jefferson, they were about Thomas Edison, and they really made you feel, I think, a sense of the childhood of the person that you were reading about. So when you're a kid, you're reading about them as a kid. And I think what so struck me was the whole idea that his mother died when he was young. Like all of us, I think the emotion of his trying to figure out how to read late into the night when he hardly had the light to be able to do it, scouring the countryside for books, reading everything he could lay his hands on. There was such an identity with that. And my own mother died when I was relatively young. So I think that produced an even extra sense of attachment to this extraordinary man.
How much of the myth of Lincoln that's in textbooks and school books is actually true? Honest Abe.
Well, you know, what I found out was that I knew I was going to respect him as a great statesman, and that turns out to be absolutely true. What I hadn't realized was that he would be such a brilliant politician. And in a time like ours, when politics is not being honored in the same way, that was the greatest part for me, to realize you could be a great politician. It didn't mean you weren't clever, didn't mean you weren't sometimes manipulating things, it didn't mean you weren't compromising at times, but there was always a worthy ambition that really carried him through his life to leave the world a little bit better place for his having lived in it, so that his story could be told after he died.
He was almost obsessed with that, wasn't he?
I think so.
Because he had melancholic periods, but he kept going because of the sense of, I want my name, I want people to know who I am after I die.
Yeah, I think what happened is because there was so much death in his early life, his mother dying when he was 9, his sister dying soon thereafter in childbirth, his first love, Anne Rutledge, dying at 22, and his mother didn't hold out for him the promise when she lay dying that she'd see him in another world, in an afterlife. So he became obsessed with the worry that when you die, your earthly existence comes to an end, and seemed to adopt what I came to believe was an old Greek notion, that you could live on if you accomplished something worthy enough so that your story could be told after you die. And that became almost like his lodestar. It carried him through all the depressions in his early life, and really through the darkest days of the war, and boy, did he achieve that.
You have said that you really, because one of the things I remember reading about Lincoln was that he was depressed. And in your research, and other people have written this as well, you feel that it's more that he had a melancholic disposition, not that he had true clinical depression.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think we've made too much of the idea that he was clinically depressed, or even depressed throughout his life, partly because of the pictures of him, because they never smiled in the 19th century, because he had that unfortunate beard, and because we do know that he was probably born with a melancholy temperament. We've overlaid on him, I think, without understanding that he was a man who understood his own moods. He could get himself out of his sadnesses by his storytelling, by his hilarious humor, and he was the one who kept everyone else's spirits alive during the Civil War rather than the other way around.
He had great EQ, we call it nowadays.
Absolutely, the best. I mean, that's really what my own discovery about living with him was. I mean, he understood how to deal with his moods. He understood how to deal with other people, to share credit, to take the blame when other things went wrong, to acknowledge his errors, to learn from mistakes. I mean, he was an emotionally extraordinarily mature man.
Perhaps empathetic to a fault, though, because when it came to marry Todd Lincoln, who he broke off an engagement with several times, he felt really bad and he didn't want to hurt her, and ultimately married her.
No, I think that's true. I think he's born with this empathy. Even when animals were hurt when he was a child, he couldn't bear watching it. He couldn't indulge in the other little boys' activities where they might throw hot coals on backs of turtles. And you're right, I think that empathy was his greatest strength, but sometimes a weakness. For example, with McClellan, he should have fired that general much earlier, but he knew what it would mean to him. He knew that it would hurt him, so he kept letting him have more and more, a second chance, a third chance, and finally, he had to put an artificial deadline on himself. If he doesn't move his troops by X date, I'm going to finally fire him.
Well, you've given me a good segue, because one of his strengths knowing probably that he had a hard time making some decisions, was to surround himself with people that could help him make those decisions, that had more knowledge. And your book, Team of Rivals, is named because he picked for his cabinet people who had been his rivals, 3 of them in the Republican nomination for president.
It was an unprecedented act at the time because most presidents at that time chose people who believed like they did, who supported their positions.
And now.
And now, exactly. I mean, here were guys who not only had been his rivals for the Republican nomination, but they had been former Whigs, former Democrats, former nativists, abolitionists. They were conservative, they were liberal, they were radical even. And by putting them all in his cabinet, it meant that he had to argue with them every day. Sometimes the sessions were incredibly boisterous, but it meant he sharpened his thinking in a way that cabinet members today, when they're just sort of repeating what the president wants them to say, nothing new is happening. Nothing is helping the president become a better leader. He understood that. Somebody said to him, how can you put these people there? They're better known than you. They have more education. They are much more experienced. He said, they're the strongest men in the country. The country's in peril. I need them by my side. And he was so right. And he ended up mastering them all.
And we don't, unfortunately, have time to go into detail about all of them, but they were Seward, who was his Secretary of State, who many people know for Seward's quote-unquote folly, Alaska, Stanton, the Secretary of War, Chase, the Secretary of Treasury, and Bates, the Attorney General. And their stories are superbly told in here. One person that stood out for me was Seward.
Oh, me too. I think what happened very early in the research, I went to Seward's house in Auburn, New York, and it's still in private hands, so it's exactly as it was when he lived there. And there's nothing like walking through somebody's house and seeing the books they read with the notes in the margin, seeing the desk that he used, which was a little chair that had a swivel on it, where he could put his cigars and put his snuff and all the things he used. I felt his presence early in this process, and the fact that he was so irrecoverably disappointed to not win that nomination.
That's right.
Everybody thought he should have won. And yet,
for president, we should say.
For the Republican Party, because he was the most celebrated anti-slavery orator of the 50s. The fact that he was able eventually to become Lincoln's partner and Lincoln's most intimate friend was an extraordinary strength of his as well as of Lincoln's, and I loved their relationship. Lincoln would go over to his house late at night, put his legs up on the chair, and they'd talk about theater. They went to the theater 100 times together. They loved reading books, and they could talk about other things than the war, and that became a really important relationship for Lincoln.
And in fact, Seward helped him write some of his speeches, gave him some of the famous words that we now know today. And for that first inaugural address, kind of toned it down a little bit to help Lincoln.
Exactly. I mean, I think Lincoln was making a somewhat more aggressive first inaugural toward the South, and Seward was still hoping at that point that there was a chance that the South could be kept into the Union without going the way it finally went. But you're absolutely right. At the end, the beautiful language that Lincoln eventually took up, the mystic chords of memory, Seward had had something that was kind of nice like that, and then Lincoln turned what was pretty into beauty, as he could with his poetic ability.
Before we move on and talk a little bit more politics, one thing that interested me very much in your book were the bonds that men shared with each other in these days. We should say that one of the reasons as well that you chose to write this book is there was so much source material, so many letters between the men and their wives, although not Lincoln so much and Mary Todd Lincoln, but the others, and letters between the men. And there seemed to be just this sentimentality, especially among young men, for each other, that it almost bordered on ardor,
Oh, absolutely.
But, that they would express their love for each other, but they weren't homosexual.
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you take these letters out of context with our current obsession with sex, you might assume when you hear Stanton, for example, who becomes Lincoln's war secretary, writing to Chase, who becomes his Treasury secretary, when they're in their 30s, right, and they've both lost their wives, and he says, ever since our pleasant intercourse last summer, no one is in my mind more waking or sleeping. I can't wait to take you by the hand and tell you I love you. It would sound strange to our modern ears, but they're all writing like that. Seward is writing like that to another state senator. I feel positively womanish about you. I miss you when you're not here. So unless we assume they're all having sex with each other, which I don't think, men were freer in that day and age to write each other with that kind of ardor, as you say.
And the other thing that stands out in these letters are the women. Strong women in this book, advising their men, cajoling their men, praising them, but also criticizing, feeling free to criticize them. These were some really strong women who unfortunately didn't have their own professions, and in fact sometimes got nervously sick maybe because they didn't have any outlet for themselves.
Oh, I think that's true. In the 19th century, it does seem that women suffered these neuritis, neuralgia, these strange illnesses, which were probably depression fostered in the first place because they had all these talents and they couldn't exercise them. Frances Seward, Seward's wife, was brilliant. She'd gone on in education. She reminded me in many ways of Eleanor Roosevelt in the sense that she was always concerned with what should be done rather than what could be done. And she was much more of a radical than Seward and constantly criticizing him for making compromises, especially on the slavery issue. And he listened to her, and he knew when she criticized him that that was the critique that worried him the most.
On slavery, I mean, I had known this, but it really hit home when I read the book that Lincoln really was not an abolitionist. And it certainly in the beginning and for quite a while, he saw slavery as something that, could go on in the South and would probably die out of its own, and then came to believe that it really was breaking up the Union. But he didn't believe certainly in equal rights, in intermarriage, in blacks being able to vote, and it took a while for him to even concede to have blacks go into the Army.
Yeah, I think the important thing again to realize in the context of the time is that very few people, even in the North, were abolitionists. They all wanted slavery to end in the South, but there was a widespread prejudice, unfortunately, about the idea that blacks and whites could not live on a plane of equality. And Lincoln shared in that prejudice. Though I think what needs to be understood, too, is that once he got into the presidency and became close to Frederick Douglass, the great black orator and abolitionist, Douglass eventually said he had never met with anyone, and he had met with all the white abolitionists who didn't treat him with condescension the way Lincoln was completely free from prejudice. And at the end, Douglass understood that Lincoln had moved enormously from where he started. And the last speech Lincoln gave before he was killed by John Wilkes Booth spoke about giving the right to vote to black Americans. Wilkes Booth was in the audience, said that means Negro citizenship, I've got to get him. So in a certain sense, he died for the very thing that people now criticize him for not believing in the first place.
Do you think there was a turning point for Lincoln where he took the cause on, the anti-slavery cause on a personal basis versus that it was something that was going to break the country? And
I think at the beginning there was a worry that if the Union were broken up as a result of the anti-slavery thing being undone in the South, that you'd lose the whole idea of democracy. And he thought if America lost itself, like if the South broke up, then maybe someday the West would go away from the East, and all the people in the world who didn't like the idea that we as ordinary people could govern ourselves would say, you see, it doesn't work.
But do you think he felt in his heart at a certain point that about emancipating slaves?
Oh, I think he always felt in his heart that this is something that he wanted to have happen for this country. The question was, when did he have the power to exercise it, and what was the right timing? He later said if he had emancipated the slaves 6 months earlier, he would have lost the border states, and then the whole thing would have been lost. But if he'd waited any longer, he would have lost the morale boost that it provided. So that was the political decision made and the legal decision made as to when he could do it, but it was always in his heart. But I do think as he got closer to understanding the black soldiers and their courage, as his friendship with Frederick Douglass deepened, then he began to understand that blacks could be more equal to white, and hopefully the future of our country would be better as a result.
In fact, his empathetic nature extended to him having some empathy for people in the South.
Yes, that's right. I mean, that's where that second inaugural becomes so important. I mean, here the North is on the verge of winning the Civil War, and you might have expected a triumphal speech at that moment. And what does he do instead? He says the sin of slavery was shared by both sides. Both sides read the same Bible. Both prayed to the same God. Neither's prayers were fully answered. And then the glorious words on the monument, with malice toward none and charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. I mean, that's where that empathy makes you realize that a great politician is able to see things from all different points of view, and who better to have brought the South back into the Union. In a certain sense, the South finally came to understand they lost their best friend when Lincoln was killed.
And in fact, his cabinet behind his back was not always very nice to him, but he had charity towards them and kept them employed, didn't fire them.
Now, sometimes that was hard to understand just on a human basis. For example, Chase, as Secretary of the Treasury, wanted so much to be president himself that he was surreptitiously trying to run against Lincoln in 1864, saying horrible things about Lincoln. And Lincoln just kept him on as long as he was doing a good job. He said, I don't mind what he's saying about me. And then almost unbelievingly, he puts him in as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after he wins the nomination and the election. And his friends go to him and said, Lincoln, how can you do that? Don't you know the horrible things he's been been saying about you? He said, I know meaner things that Chase has said about me than any of you do, and on a personal basis, I'd rather swallow a chair than appoint him to this post. But he'll be the best man for the rights of the emancipated slaves. He was a fervent abolitionist. So he was able to put aside what most of us human beings cannot do, those personal feelings of revenge or anger or hurt, in the larger cause. And then in the end, that only helps him.
Can we use this in today's government? Would it be practicable, for instance, for President Bush to have invited Mr. McCain, Senator McCain, into his government?
You wish it would, but I think it's probably much harder today. I mean, the problem is that the campaigns are so negatively personal today, so I think the hurt that's felt is much harder to just put in the past. And secondly, I think the journalists would be looking for all these arguments that might be going on. I mean, at the time of Lincoln's cabinet, even though they're saying bad things about one another, it's sort of kept within the inner circle of gossip. But can you imagine if on the nightly news every night, people were saying, oh, McCain said this horrible thing about Bush, or suppose you put Teddy Kennedy into the cabinet. I mean, Teddy Kennedy said this about Bush. It would be harder today. But on the other hand, there's something so valuable about recognizing that the governing is so difficult today. And if you can bring in people from different points of view and who've come from different parts of the party, you're going to be a better leader. And in the long run, that's so critical for our country.
I wonder if we'll ever see that in our lifetime.
I think what it would take is a person who has an enormous self-confidence, because that's what it means. You have to know in yourself that you're willing to look a little bit weak at times by not surrounding yourself with yes people. You're going to have to argue with them. You may have to stand up against them. But in the long run, you're going to be a better leader. But that takes a confidence person. I've got to believe somebody can come back like that. Look, Roosevelt, when he became president, as World War II was on the horizon, he brought in 2 top Republicans to serve as Secretary of War and Secretary of the Navy. It can be done. Now it's just sort of a token person that goes in there. But we're talking in Lincoln's case about the top people who were his rivals. I'm not sure we're going to easily see that again, but boy, I wish we could.
Now, just as an aside, President Bush has read your book.
Yes.
And you know that because?
He sent me a handwritten letter saying that he had just finished it and how much he enjoyed it. And, you know, there's something so special, I think, about whatever one's political views are, about presidents reading about other presidents. And I think probably Lincoln, more than any other president, has been read by Teddy Roosevelt, read him in the middle of the coal strike. It is said that Truman sent people to read about what he did with McClellan when he was trying to figure out about firing MacArthur. And Roosevelt was reading him during the Depression. So it makes you feel there's a circle coming around when these so few people are president that they should gain strength from looking into the past presidents.
What do you think Lincoln would have done next, or what would he have wanted to attack next had he lived?
Well, it's a really wonderful question. I mean, I think, first of all, obviously, he would have had to bring the South back into the Union and assure that the black people in the South were going to have their rights protected. That's what, unfortunately, did not happen. You know, at first they were brought back into the Union too quickly, some people thought, in the South, and then when the troops were taken away, then segregation was instituted all over again. So I think his primary concern would have been to protect the rights of the blacks in the South and bring them back into the Union. Then it's really interesting to wonder, how would Lincoln have responded with the Republican Party to the industrialization at the turn of the century, to the monopolies that were growing? I mean,
he originally ran on an infrastructure plank.
Exactly.
Mean, improving infrastructure.
And what his real goal was, he said that in a certain sense, what the form of democracy was to ensure that everybody could rise to the level of their own talent, that there were no artificial burdens put on them. So I think I'd like to believe that he would have been one, perhaps with Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century, fighting, you know, possibly for labor, fighting for the rights of people to be able to at least exercise their talents. But he would have remained a Republican. People always say, would he have been something different? He loved that party that had become really his party in so many ways.
He would still be a Republican today,
I think he'd be fighting for republicanism today, to be perhaps more open toward making sure that everybody in the country has equal opportunity.
This was a man who had never traveled outside of his own country. Do you think he would have words of wisdom for what is going on in our situation today, where we're so enmeshed in global tragedy?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Even on the last afternoon of his life, he and Mary Lincoln took a carriage ride together, and they were imagining what they might do when their presidency came to an end. and he had not traveled anywhere, and he couldn't wait to even go over the Rocky Mountains to California. That was his goal. That's what he thought would be far. She wanted to go to Europe, and he wanted to go to the Holy Land. So I think one thing he would have wanted to do would be to travel the world so he could understand, so that empathy would give him an understanding of culture. Because I think the first thing he'd say, with everything being so complicated today, is you can't try and impose things on countries unless you have an understanding of their history and their past. And that's where I think his experience, if he would want to, would have traveled wherever he could so he could get that empathy alive.
What would you like to ask Lincoln if you had the opportunity to talk with him?
You know, the embarrassing thing is I've thought about this. I mean, suppose I had an hour with him, and what are the important questions I'd ask him? But I think instead I would simply say, Mr. Lincoln, tell me your stories. Because it was said that when he would tell one of his funny stories, that this face of his would suddenly come alive. There'd be a twinkle in his eye. He would tell the story, and he'd laugh so hard his own leg would be slapped. And then he would really be alive in front of me. So I think instead of whatever I'd think of as the things I should think of as an historian, what do I want him to know? I just simply tell me 5 of your best stories, because I love those stories.
We should say that the bicentennial of his birth is coming up in 2009. Will you be involved at all in any activity?
Yes, I'm already on an advisory panel, and there's lots of stuff going on. I mean, it's really going to be wonderful, I think, because the museum in Springfield now is terrific. I've been to that museum, and tons of people are going through it already. And then they've got this Congressional Bicentennial Commission and state commissions. So I think we can't overemphasize too much the memory of a person like Lincoln, who walked amidst our ranks, and who, if could come back again, our country would be in a better place. So the more we can remember who he was and why he was strong and what he was all about and what his emotional strengths are, the better we'll be.
Now, is this book going to be a movie? I've heard that it
Yes,
has been optioned by
Steven Spielberg.
somebody
Actually,
very well
some
known.
time ago, he before I even finished, and he set a couple script writers to it, and he's chosen Liam Neeson to play Abraham Lincoln, which I think is a great choice. I mean, he looks like him, and I actually saw him. They did him up with the beard and sepia tone, and I just saw a film of him for 10 minutes, and it was eerie how much he looked like. But more importantly, I think he's got an emotional quality that he projects in the actions that he's played. So I think it's pretty exciting.
And are you and your husband still planning to write a book on great presidential decisions?
Well, we've been thinking about that. I mean, at least there's something that's come out of this book, which is what are the leadership lessons from Lincoln, and they're relevant to a lot of other people. So we're thinking about that. But I've also sort of fallen in love lately with Teddy Roosevelt and the Progressive Era and Taft and the muckrakers, those great journalists in that golden age of journalism, Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens. So I think that's what I'm going to do first. And my husband's been involved in writing a play about Galileo and Pope Urban VIII that is hopefully going to come to America. It was in England last year.
Well, hopefully you can get little breaks in between, and one of them being the Sun Valley Writers Conference.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for taking the
you're so
time to speak with
welcome.
me and
Thank
our
you.
viewers. It's so nice to see you again.
Thank you. You too.
That's all the time we have. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Sun Valley Writers Conference and Ms. Goodwin for making time in her schedule for this interview. For more information, please go to our website. For Idaho Public Television, I'm Marcia Franklin.
Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web